Welcome to the latest installment of the In Conversation podcast. Today, I'm joined by Doctors Bob Klaber, Rupal Shah, and Jens Foell for a special episode of our Fighting for the Soul of General Practice series, where we discuss challenges facing the global healthcare profession. Ru and Jens, it's great to see you. Welcome back to the show. I'm really glad you could join us again today. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, James.
Thank you.
And Bob, welcome to the show. And again, thank you for your time. It's great to have you on. How's things going?
Yeah, all good. Thank you very much. Great fun to be here with you, and curious to discover what happens next.
Well, it sounds like you've already had a busy day, but I'm gonna ask you a few questions today about the topic of kindness and kindness within the healthcare profession. But to begin with, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself? So who are you and what are your roles, maybe both as an educator and also as a clinician?
Yeah, well, listen, thanks so much for having me, and great to be here. So yeah, my name's Bob Klaber. I'm a paediatrician, very much a general paediatrician. Get the privilege of sort of trying to grapple my way through all sorts of things that get thrown at you in the space of children and young people, and I get to do all of my outpatient work is actually not done in outpatients, is done in general practice. I was out this morning in Hammersmith and Fulham, hanging out with friends of Ru's and others, and taking a very multidisciplinary approach to that. So that's a bit about me. I do a bit of inpatient work, but that's probably about 15% of my time, of a relatively big denominator. My main job is as one of the exec directors at Imperial College Healthcare. So Imperial is one of the bigger NHS trusts in the country. We run St Mary's and Charing Cross and Hammersmith, as well as Mother and Baby set up at Queen Charlotte's and the Western Eye Hospital. And I have a role there as the Director of Strategy, Research, Innovation. Really interesting role, super broad. I guess the Director of Strategy, a bit like what it says on the tin, but I'm responsible for the research we do and innovation, doing lots of think about our role as an anchor in our local community. We're a big organization. We employ 15,500 people, have about 1.5 million patient contacts a year. So there's lots of things going on to follow up on that, doing lots on health equity, on thinking about sustainability. I've just been out running from here, slightly out of breath and a bit late, in one of our local schools, talking with a group of sixth formers who we're sort of co-designing a careers program with, really playing to that anchors bit. And then I have this sort of what my medical students years ago described as a side hustle, and I realized I sort of no, it's not a side hustle, it's actually the main hustle, which is focusing on culture and on, I guess, reflecting this sort of slightly crazy thing that goes on. Is healthcare is about care, and yet time and time again there's a whole load of practice and behaviors that are fundamentally unkind, detrimental to the outcomes and the common mission and purpose we're trying to achieve. And so this work on kindness, which has really built a head of steam over the last 6 years or so, is really front and central to, I guess, everything that I'm trying to do. So yeah, it'll be good fun to explore that with you a bit.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I always like to start these conversations off with a bit of taking it right the way back and just asking, why did you become a doctor? Was it an accident? Was it your mother's idea? And have you ended up in the role that you imagined when you set forth on this kind of adventure?
Listen, I've rehearsed for none of these questions at all, but about an hour ago with a bunch of sixth formers, we were chatting about the same stuff. So two angles to the story. One is, I guess, children and pediatrics. So I'm a big sportsman. I absolutely love sport and played a lot of different sports, a bit of a generalist, I think, a jack of all trades, never brilliant at any of them, quite good at a few of them. But actually, when I was 15, 16, 17, my summer job was coaching kids sport. So definitely the teacher in me and the educator sort of picked up lots of stuff. But I had a number of fun Easter, summer, half-term holidays, earning a bit of cash, teaching kids how to play sport, tennis, football, athletics, cricket, badminton, and things like that. I didn't even play badminton, so I had to sort of work that one out pretty quick. But that was fantastic, and really sort of got me into that. Both my parents were doctors, and what that gave me great privilege to do was to really see what the role was all about. So I saw them come home occasionally broken from what the day that they just had given, and on other times sort of energized and inspired by the experiences that they'd had and their involvement in the care they'd been able to give. So my great privilege was having a really, really clear insight to what the job was all about. So I looked at a few other different things, but by the time I was probably 16, 17, I was pretty convinced I wanted to do it. And I think having started with that privilege that I had through mum and dad, I have always felt like I just know that it was going to be the thing for me. And I've just, in a way, what I was sharing with the sixth formers just now is there's so many amazing opportunities within healthcare. And of course, we weren't just talking about careers in medicine, but I've used medicine as a base and a pivot to get involved in amazing AI stuff, to understand about research, to think about an organizational role with anchors, to get into political conversations, to be out with communities and understanding about what matters to people. And sustainability would be another example. So it's been a brilliant decision. Definitely the influence of understanding what it was all about from early on was important. And I think it got me thinking earlier about how do we give people whose mums and dads aren't doctors deep opportunities to really get a sense and understand. And I guess, look, there's a role for the media and there's a role for these sorts of conversations in trying to help do that.
Oh, well, thanks for sharing that. It's always nice to get people's sort of origin story, especially when we're talking about things a little bit more abstract, such as like kindness. And in addition to all of those roles that you've mentioned, I know that you're one of the leaders of kindness in healthcare, this sort of network of 1,400 people from 34 different countries. So I think that's a nice place to start when it comes to exploring kindness in healthcare. And I guess to speak of kindness in the context of public policy could be tricky, and I imagine it raises a few sighs and dismissive raised eyebrows. So I wanted to start off by asking you, sort of in this world and this system where doctors are becoming, and I'll quote my good friend here, Jens Foell, street level bureaucrats who are under immense pressure to deliver results that are often based on sort of hard metrics, facts and data. How do you kind of define kindness, and what is kindness to you, and why is it so important in the healthcare profession at this time and moving forward?
Yeah, wow. So there's a load in that. So I think one of the things that I and quite a lot of others working in this space have really tried to do is to not get caught up in too much complexity, if you like, of technical definitions, and try to be very practical in our definitions, if you like, and in what we're really talking about. But there are some really important pieces. So the thing I want to dive onto is two things. One is this really interesting set of confusion that goes on about two very simple four-letter words that primary school kids across the country, and indeed across any of the English-speaking world, but super interestingly wider than the English-speaking world, can get into some of this. And the global work we've been doing has been really interesting to understand this a bit more. But anyone listening will have a good sense of what kind means, and will have a good sense of what nice means. And the two get really, really conflated in all sorts of ways. And interesting, there was a big sort of hoo-ha on social media about this a little while ago when the GMC, the General Medical Council, the regulator for doctors as a professional body in the UK, sort of started to put in some of their guidance that doctors needed to be kind. And people say, well, it's not nice sitting there telling somebody they've got cancer. Well, of course it's not a nice thing, but actually the way and the approach in which we can do things can be kind. So what is really clear, with the odd exception where people have experienced deep trauma and experiences that one can't begin to understand, or one can attempt to walk next to people around, but in almost every case being kind is an action and it's a choice. So we're talking here behaviors, we're talking about how we choose to act. So I guess I'll give a sort of simple thing. You sometimes see from people where they behave really poorly and their behavior has a significant impact on someone else, and they go, oh, I'm really sorry, I'm just having a really bad day. Shoulder shrug.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that may well be absolutely true as context, that they are having a really difficult day, and none of us know, the four of us on this call don't really know what's going on in each other's lives at the moment and the context in which we're having this conversation. However, that context of having a bad day is context. And how we behave is how we behave, and it is a choice, as I say, in almost every circumstance. Not all. There are some interesting things that people have pointed out where sometimes that might not be the case. And I think how we recognize and value that becomes really key. So this idea, and we've learned this through these really amazing collaboration across this incredible group of people, is really focusing on the act, the behaviors. And what you get into there is this really interesting stuff that actually it's really measurable. So you can measure the conditions by which it's more likely to happen. You can measure intent. You can measure outcomes. And what's really interesting is you can measure outcomes in the people who receive it. So James, I might be particularly kind to you, but actually you can also measure how that leaves me feeling and what that does. So there's this really interesting bit, and there's friends down in the University of Sussex are well worth looking up. And some of the guys listening will have come across the BBC Radio 4 kindness test that Robin Banerjee and Claudia Hammond did. And the guys down in Sussex are amazing. Gillian Sandstrom, Robin Banerjee, and team, Karen Patterson. They've been looking at things like the science behind charitable giving, and actually how that's lived. So there's a growing set of research in this space. And one of the things that I'll hopefully weave into this conversation is there's a heavyweight evidence base around this stuff. So let's put a big banner up for people listening, deciding, do I carry on listening to this conversation? Well, if you are interested in what makes high performing teams, if you're interested in how to deliver the very best outcomes for your patients, for whatever you're doing, then you need to get really, really serious about this, because there's a bucket load of evidence that points to this being really, really critical. We can get into that.
My question is, what kind of sorry state are we in that this becomes an issue? That should be something that is implicit, and implicitly when it's there, but it shouldn't be something that is explicit and putting down in writing by the GMC and being inquired about in appraisals. Then it became something unkind. That is my fundamental niggle with the concept. And I think that should be something that is not worth mentioning. It should be something, if you're in a helping, caring profession, of course you are kind, otherwise you wouldn't be there.
Well, so listen, let me dive in on that. And Rouge, you would come in on the conversation, but I agree with your sentiment deeply, but unfortunately, that is not where we're at. We have a system that is, the aim of it is very clear. It's called care, yet it is fundamentally unkind. And the problem is, and why, and Jens, people can't see you're sort of smiling at me on it, but the reason why your argument, I wish, was right, but sadly, categorically, I'm afraid isn't, is because there's so much noise on all the other stuff. And this work, and we'll touch on it a bit, that amazing lady called Julia Unwin beautifully described about the need to have a balance between the rational, the systems, the processes, the evidence, the data, the stuff, if you like, that is, to your characterization, is getting written down, and the relational. We have to have balance. We have deep imbalance at the moment. So there's something about, and people on the call can't see, trying to make some noise about this fact we have to have this equal bit. Now, I agree with you that people putting things in appraisals and, people putting it down as standards, in a way, they're pretty weak tools. They're not great levers. What is a more important lever is people like you and me and people listening on this call being very, very clear that this is the starting point. So you can't have a conversation about productivity or about inclusion or about equity or about safety unless you get this stuff right. So yeah. I refuse to have conversations about any of those things unless we start with this, because all of the evidence points, you need to start with this if you want to make care safer, if you want to make it more equitable.
Yeah,
I like that. So it's not something we make time for. It's at the front and center of everything that we do. I think that's a really important distinction that we should make at this early stage in the conversation. Thanks for that, guys. But Ru, let me bring you in here as well. I think, do you have a question?
I mean, I've spent years writing and arguing for relational care, which, as Bob says, kindness is a fundamental principle for that. I'm just worried about kindness becoming weaponized in the way that resilience has, or reflection. I was running a kind of teaching session yesterday, and we're talking about reflection, and learners there were saying, oh, well, we have to reflect because it's part of our clinical governance. And that feels quite worrying to me. And I think resilience is used in a similar way. Be resilient. It's the onus is on you. And I think kindness kind of grows in places where it's allowed to flourish, where people are kind to one another, where the system kind of is a kind system. I think if you've got a context where people are really stretched, going off sick, there's too many patients, not enough time, and kindness just becomes another chore, it's quite difficult.
Yeah, listen, and what you say is really wise and really resonates. But in a way, my observation is that everything can become weaponized. We've definitely had some really interesting experience of seeing this. So at Imperial, when I first joined the organization, so I started as a consultant in 2009. The reason I decided to apply for Imperial was purely because the children's department here at St Mary's was wonderful and still is. And the organization at the time was a dreadful organization. Categorically an awful, out of control, poorly led, all over the place organization with a culture that I did not recognize as something I wanted to be part of. So part of my leadership journey has been to step up more and more and more into that space, and working with some brilliant other colleagues, particularly over the last 10 years since 2014. And we had a new chief exec come in back in 2014 called Tracy Batten, and there've been a few years. We got an amazing chief exec, Tim, my immediate boss, for the last 6 years. But a group of us have started to, over 10 years across staff, to say we're not prepared to be part of an organization like that and change the culture really from within. And that is a decade in and is ongoing work. Now, back 10 years ago, we did some co-design work around what really matters to our staff. And they told us that kind was one of the really important things. So it became one of our values, and we focused a lot on being really explicit. What are the behaviors that we expect to see, we would love to see, and actually we won't accept and we don't tolerate, specifically related to kind? And we've named them and used them. And I was a bit like Jens. I was like, why on earth are we having to write this stuff down? That's crazy. But what's really interesting is lots and lots of staff. So I was wrong, really wrong on that. Lots of staff have come and said to us they find it so helpful as a framework for a conversation with people. Now, what happens sometimes is we get, like on an all-staff briefing, people will actively weaponize kind. They'll say things like, talking to staff about the fact that people need to work in a hybrid way, that means coming into work 2 or 3 times a week and not working from home 5 days a week. Well, that's really unkind, because we've got to get on a, like, no, it's not. So one of the things we've got, if you like, clear and strong about and feisty about is being able to call some of this stuff out. So this is not a soft conversation, this is a really hard one. So let me just put one of the things that I've grown into more and more. This is not only an asset-based conversation. This is about calling out things where things are a problem. So I have a phrase around this, is like, what are you prepared to walk past on stuff? So we're doing a lot to think about the active bystander role. And as a white 6'3" man doctor executive, I have a bucket load of privilege and agency to be really bold and strong around this stuff. And my take on it is, I don't care how important you think you are, I'm going to take you on around this stuff and get really, really hard-nosed about it. So I am not prepared to continue. I've got, I know 10, 20 years working in healthcare. I'm not prepared to continue to have a healthcare system that is fundamentally deeply riddled with harassment, with bullying, with unkind behaviors. It's deeply counterproductive. It is a massive, massive issue for us as a country, and we cannot continue. The exciting bit is there's a whole bunch of other people who are just not prepared to stand up for it either. And we've got to get really, really hard-nosed about it. So this is not a soft conversation. This is the hardest, most important conversation that there is. If I do one more thing in the rest of my career, it's this. It's not all the other stuff. I mean, my view is exactly as you clocked, James, this is the starting point around this stuff. We've got to get serious about it. Our job is care, yet we work in a environment and a system that puts a whole load of things that are fundamentally uncaring. That's just crazy.
I think this is going to resonate with a lot of people, both patient and practitioner alike.
Bob, indirectly, I can second what you are saying and what you are doing. I'm an appraiser in Hammersmith and Fulham, and so many people tell me how the relationship between secondary care, primary care has changed, what difference it makes to have an outpatient clinic in the practice, to have relational care based with secondary care, that this bit, I speak to you, we care together, is back there. And that is not implicit kindness because you happen to be a kind guy. That is something that comes with, I would say, social engineering. And that is something I noticed, and it does work. Same with co-design and co-production, working together. Relationships between primary general practice and secondary care are increasingly impersonal, and so many times I would like to say to the person on the other hand, saying, "What's your name? My name is Jens Foell. Hello, my name is not only for patients, it's also for colleagues." The shadow speaks the truth is often hostile, impersonal. The wording we get in letters is inappropriate referral. It's infused in blocking, defensiveness, unkindness. Sorry, it's a you problem, suck it up. And that is part that demoralizes so many of co-carers. And we are also co-carers and not tribalistic door bouncers.
Listen, sending you a virtual hug your way. You're so spot on. But listen, let's think big for a minute about the country's conundrum. So we've got an NHS budget of £200 billion, give or take a few quid, and the inflationary pressure on healthcare just and the sums don't add up based around the need. And Jens, what I want to do is almost, if I'm not an economist, I'm a paediatrician, but if you put an economist's line on the cost of the failure to connect and build the sorts of relationships that you're describing, so fragmentation that we have, it's almost like having a laugh. A friend or colleague or an industry person who works in a different country goes, "Oh, I'm so excited about coming to work with the NHS because it's like one thing and 55 million people." I'm like, you're having a laugh. It's deeply fragmented. And as you've clocked, what we do is we get into this really daft set of behaviors that is rubbishing each other. So my colleagues in hospital say, "Oh, the bloody GPs, ... And you guys are sitting there and falling, and we all fall into this trap. And we've got this whole language about primary care this and secondary care. So we're getting pretty animated at the minute, language about, the big acutes. And all we need to do is like move some budget from the big acutes into, what a lack of understanding about how things work. What we need to do is open up these connections. So people working in secondary care need to make themselves deeply available to help and support in all sorts of ways for you guys. And the lovely thing is it's two ways. So I think one of the most fun and rewarding things I've ever done is I'm now up to about 170 GPs who over the last 12 years have sat in with me, and I've sat in with them. And I was there this morning sitting in with Shirin, who's one of our old GP trainees from a decade ago. So Jens, the fact that you know half of the lot in Hammersmith and Fulham, and so do I, and in fact so does Ru, that's in some ways a coincidence, but to your point, has come from intentional, deliberate activity to learn together, to spend time together, to listen to each other, to understand where we're coming from and recognize we're all just human beings trying to make the world that little bit better. Let's do it together. So I think you're onto something really important, but we persist on this language that is what I call push language. I'm going to refer a patient here. I'm going to discharge them there. We talk about flow. These are what I call sewage words, that are not. What are we doing? Why are we wasting so much time, energy, and if you like, morale, rather than saying, "Look, I'm Jens, I'm looking after these really complex group of children. Hey, Bob, can you and your team at St Mary's give us a hand? I'm particularly worried about this. I'd love to talk to you about this. Can we have a look at some of the data here? You don't happen to know anyone who's an endocrine expert, do you?" That's the different set of conversations we've got to have. And I think we've got to get ourselves And to me, there's something about all of us who work in healthcare to stop falling for this trap that we're in these sort of fragmented things. Fragmentary behavior can be overcome by building connections. So look, if everyone listening to your name point, go and find out who your local doctors are. Go visit them. Go and spend some time with them. Let's spend some time with each other. Ru, come on in.
So we've recorded a podcast about failure demand, which is exactly what you're describing, Bob. The demand on the system generated because of failures within the system, and fragmentation is one of them. And our argument is that relational care, which includes kindness, is an antidote to failure demand. I mean, what I've started doing a lot now is tracking consultants down. So, you get a kind of generic letter, but if you look, you can usually figure out who is the main consultant, and I can track them down on NHS Net, and I just send emails now, and I get lovely responses back, and we can actually have a coherent kind of conversation. And it's really interesting because that's quite radical. Like, it shouldn't be. It's like really common sense, but other people don't do that. And there's this sort of feeling like, well, we're exposing ourselves a bit. It's personal email. It's kind of, we should, maybe we shouldn't do that. And anyway, it's just interesting that it's not part of the culture anymore, which is absolutely crazy. Actually, it's a very effective way of working.
Exactly. And the point is like, what are we exposing ourselves to? That's the bit I don't understand. So I mean, I agree. And people have said to me, so when I started as a consultant, back in 2009, I put my personal NHS email address on every bit of correspondence I've ever written. Hey, a little by the way, why are we still all writing letters to each other? ? I mean, which other bit of your life do you write letters to people? That's just a weird thing that we all do. And the thing is about emailing contact, and you've got, there's something about you that's got the bit, I'm just going to email. And I loved your response, that you get really energetic, kind, thoughtful responses back. The trick is if you know each other a bit. And how do you get to know each other? You get to know each other by spending a bit of time with each other, by being at a learning event together, by having a clinical conversation and recognizing. So my learning thing, I know I've learned more off the GPs I've worked with than they've ever learned off me. That is absolutely clear in my mind.
It's quite nice to challenge sometimes and say, you've ordered this like specialized investigation, but guy's 90, and like, I'm just wondering where you're going with this. And I think it's quite nice to have that interchange. Completely. And then, both of you change perspective a bit.
And the other bit, back on your piece about failure demand. So I think there's a beautiful nuance here, which is about clinical risk. So if you think about, and I'm really keen the conversation about fragmentation and connection gets to clinical risk. So every citizen is holding some risk about what's going on in their lives. So I don't know, let's talk about some middle-aged guy who's working on a building site and his chest is feeling a bit tight every so often. He's holding some risk about what does he want to try and do. Does he go and see someone? And eventually someone on the building site who he chats to says, mate, you need to go and see your GP about this. So he rocks up to go and see you and goes and has a conversation. And you're then trying to work out, well, do I just reassure him? Do I give some simple stuff? Or actually, do we need get some extra out? Or do we need to do some tests? Or what are we going to do? So you're trying to work out maybe you need some specialists. Maybe there's something quirky or thing about this. So then you're going to pass it in about that clinical risk bit. Now, what my observation of years and years of doing this work with GPs in the children's world is they will hold on to amazing amounts of risk. And they're not trying to exclude it. They're trying to manage it and hold it. And they'll do all the running on the work. And I just can dab in little bits on it. The unwritten deal is they know that if something a bit weird happens or something different happens, they can instantly get hold of me.
Yes.
So they'll hold on to it. So that thing they'll know. But the trouble is, if you're worried, you can never get hold of one. You want them to stay in the hepatology clinic just in case.
I'm just going to refer because I'm just going to say, well, I'm not prepared to hold on to this anymore.
Exactly.
I'm stressed out. I don't want a complaint. I don't want something to go wrong. And so I know it's probably nothing, but I'm still going to refer. And that's what creates such huge demand on the system.
And how do you refer this thing then? So in my MDT today, I had 4 or 5 times where these wonderful GPs who I know really well have just done a brilliant job, and they know they've done, and they're like, I'm 99% sure I've done everything. Can we just run this by you? And so we explicitly, so I sit there and listen, and occasionally I can come up with a tiny bit of icing on the cake, but really rarely. Usually I've got nothing more to add, but I can listen and play back and say, look, I think that's absolutely brilliant. I've really got nothing more to add. That GP will then go and phone the mum or dad and say, I've had this discussion with Bob, our paediatrician friend. We've chatted it all through. He's really happy around stuff. He thinks we're on the right track. He did add this little plan B, and he's got this good patient information leaflet that he happens to know about. Here it is. And what the message that gives to the family is that we're connected. We're part of one team.
Yes.
We're all working together. You can get hold of me anytime you want. So we've got to get our head around this idea is getting tired and busy and too busy to connect. That's a failure. That is just poor thinking. We have to invest time in spending time with each other. The more connected we can get, the less pressure we're having to hold on our own. And that is the really critical bit about that. So, and that is then about being kind to each other. So Jens, when you phone up and, you know, you're getting the once over from a year 2 SHO doctor in the hospital who's, I mean, what is that all about? If you're worried about a patient, so listen, let's run the theory here. Okay. You're worried about a patient. Scenario 1, you're a brilliant GP who's worried about the patient. Right, we're going to see the patient. Scenario number 2, you're a terrible GP who's not got a clue, and you work, well, I want to see the patient anyway, so we're going to see the patient. So let's just stop all this ridiculous charade. You know, we've got to just realize, hey, we're all in this together. Let's behave in a much more sensible way.
Yeah, I think we need to abolish like certain language in our in our own contexts about heart sinks and the eyebrow raising that we all do and all of this. I think it has a knock-on effect, doesn't it?
My radical bit is get rid of referral. Honestly, we should get rid of the phrase of referral.
Yes, absolutely. Because referral means it's a you problem now.
Exactly. It's a push. Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. And the big problem is also in the current era of not enough resources. You push people away and nobody is responsible, and they come back, well, what's happening? And this is wasteful, really, really wasteful. What is important is that you bring people with higher status in. Thank you for coming as a pediatrician, because often I know I'm right, but my word is not good enough because I'm a generalist, and people want to speak to God, or if not to God, to somebody closest to God, to higher in the shaman order.
Yeah, then they meet me, Jens, and it's profoundly disappointing. I mean, it's like some crazy illusion that I actually know what's going on. But you know what? Honestly, I think, and I really encourage people to have these conversations in front of patients, because what happens then is they can see that people are connected. So they'll look at you as a GP and think, look, that sounds okay for the moment, but let's see if this settles down. But I know that you're connected. You can always go back. So I do a lot of, when I'm doing ward rounds, my foundation year doctors and SHOs, they tease me on this because they find it like a bit crazy. But one of the really early questions I'll ask patients is like, who's your GP? So it's like right up that, you know, really like before I've got into a history, you know, they teach you like history, examinate. No, that's wrong. Before history, it's like, who's your GP? And more often than not, I know them, and I know them really well. And I'm like, oh yeah, I saw them last week, and things like. So the mum and dad and the young person who I'm just seeing are like looking, all right, this guy knows my GP, and I'm like, they're brilliant. You've got an amazing GP, things like that. And what they're left with is this sense that we're working in one team and connection. Now think about that episode of care a little bit further down the line. I'm trying to, you know, discharge them from hospital and think about how my first message was, I know your GP. I think they're absolutely brilliant. So I don't need to follow them up, because
that's trust building.
Correct. But what we end up doing is we end up rubbishing each other the whole time. That's the norm. It's got to stop. Like, stop. We've all got to think. So anybody listening, we all do it. We all fall into the trap of rubbishing each other. It's just got to stop. It's rubbish psychology. It's disastrous.
We've got to get into the habit of dialogue. I think so often, like every day, we get all these letters from hospitals saying GP to do X, Y, and Z. And you know what happens is that we almost always do it, but really grumpily. And it kind of, and I'm thinking, why are we doing it? Why aren't we just asking and saying, you know, Bob, you've told me to order like serum rhubarb, but you know, I don't really want to, and I don't understand why I'm doing it. But tell
Yeah.
me, like, I want to know what was
Well,
your thought process?
the lovely thing is I don't think I tell anyone to do anything, and really helpfully as well, I've never encountered anyone who's anything other than deeply willing to do things that we've worked out together around stuff.
Yeah.
So there's something about that that is worth, and I think it's interesting on the tech side. So obviously, people in government and industry and all of us are really interested in how technology can help enable the relational side of things. I think there's something to be really thoughtful about that, because the ability to connect, and think about what happened in the pandemic, think about really young children connecting with their great grandparents who live in Australia and all. There's so many clever things that we can do to better connect with each other. I think the ability to connect within the patient record so that stuff can get documented, the role of things like ambient AI, and thinking about how qualitative things can be measured and captured and synthesized and counted. There's some, I think, to me, the relational space and world and the argument we're all making has got a massive opportunity to have a real heyday. And
Yes.
this whole thing about what gets measured is what counts is a real issue. So one of the things I'm feisty about, and I touched on it in my intro to James, was this thing that you can measure this stuff. So part of my feistiness there is I get a lot of people saying to me, "Oh, Bob, this is amazing. This is so cool. This is so important. I can see how important this is. The trouble is you can't measure it." And I'm like, that is a power grab. So basically, people deciding what can be measured and what not, and I'm talking here political leaders, I'm talking people who sit centrally, they are deciding, not patients and citizens, what are the things that matter. So, for example, when have you guys ever met a patient who says to you, "My aim for next year is to go to A&E less times"? Now, listen, reducing the number of people who are going to A&E, and and the experience is really difficult because our A&E department's incredibly busy and people working really hard, and we've not got that right. So that's a really important bit. But I'm willing to guarantee you guys have never met a patient who said that, and I certainly haven't. We've got to ask people what are the things that really matter to them. We've got to then think about how we measure that stuff forward. So that's got to be the takeover here.
Jens and I have written a lot about era 2 medicine, which, is all about targets and outputs and standardization. And so I think that the culture of the NHS, as it seems to me, is one of where standardization, it's really privileged. And so I find that a lot of younger doctors particularly are really hesitant to kind of step outside of that system of rules in order to be kind. So, a patient might say, "I want a letter," or "Can you do something for me?" that's not kind of quite, in a guideline or a pathway, and they're thinking, "Well, I'm not allowed to do that." And so they obfuscate and they say, "Oh, well, we don't do things like that." And
The use of
I mean,
we.
yeah,
the
hate
trust, as we talk about.
Yes.
But also so really, listen, can I give everybody a bit of reading to do on things? Also, I was like thinking, I'm assuming this is audio only and people don't get the
Yeah.
chance to see us and things, so they can't see how ridiculously young we all are on the call. So I don't know what you're talking about this all
Stress hasn't taken its toll on any of our youth.
No,
No.
exactly. I still pretend I'm in my sort of, I don't know, early to mid 20s. But anyway, that aside, there's a beautiful bit of work that I used to teach with. And actually, I had a lovely message from some of my friends in this, Susie Bailey and Dominique Allwood, who were out at a conference in Orlando. They sent me a selfie with an amazing guy called Len Berry. And Len Berry has written a fantastic paper that everyone should look up, and you can easily get the full text piece of it, which demonstrates kinder care leads to better outcomes with patients in patients with cancer. So, the people who go, "Oh, look, Bob, this is great, but it's all a bit fluffy." No. This is right. We've got patients with cancer. We're interested in their outcomes being better. Kinder care leads to better care, and he's beautifully evidenced it. Now, to pick up your piece about people being uncertain about, what I love about the paper is he and team have codified the 6 areas. And James, this sort of goes back to your very opening question of sort of what's the definition. So what Len Berry does in this paper, he doesn't really give a definition of kind, but he codified 6 behaviors to really focus on. And what I love about reading, I've only read this paper about 47 times and taught on it about 800 times. What every time I do, and I'm going to do it now with this conversation, is it makes me think, how can I get better at each of those 6 things? They are things like, and I'm doing this from memory, number 1, deep listening. How do we truly listen to people? Nancy Klein stuff, listen with fascination, Michael West, deeply, deeply listen. These wretched things, mobile phones, they're a massive, brilliant thing, but they're a problem to listening. The screen, so there's something about how do you truly, truly listen to people with deep, deep intent. Really important. There's a beautiful piece about empathy. So I'm really convinced in my mind that you can't quite walk in people's shoes. You can walk next to people. And how do we really, truly try and sort of walk next to people and experience those? He uses gorgeous language, gentle honesty in conversations. So despite being ridiculously young, when I was at medical school, we were definitely taught to be dishonest about some stuff. We were taught not to admit things. 100% I remember being taught. Now, thankfully, we have moved on a bit from that. There's this beautiful bit about timely care. So I love this idea. So when I watch this really visual thing on our wards, when a child gets taken down for surgery, let's say it's something really not wildly exciting, I don't know, elective removal of their gastrostomy tube. Look, the doctors on this call just know that's not a really, you wouldn't want me doing that operation, but it's not a big deal. Yeah, the risks on that are pretty small. What I watch when I'm buzzing around on the ward as a physician is I see a mum or a dad or a carer or combination of sat by this empty bed space. Like there's no bed and there's no child. The thing they love most in the world is not there because they're under an anesthetic downstairs. And I'm watching these angst-ridden adults sitting there every second ticking away. I could easily, in a less empathetic way, this is like an elective removal of the peg, it's going to be fine, don't worry about it. But that's a nonsense thing. These parents are sitting there. What happens then is the wonderful surgeon phones up that mum and dad just as soon as the operation's finished, way before the child's returned back up, and says, really quick call, just say it's all gone beautifully well. Your little one's going to take another hour or so to get back up because they've got to go to recovery and in the lifts and the porter and thing. So go and grab yourself a coffee. It's all good. And I've got a really crazy operating list, but I'll pop back up this evening before I go home and say hello and tell you about it. And I get to watch these adults just shoulders relax, look like different people. Timely care. That call takes 30 seconds. So the idea that we're too busy to do this, no. Remember, Len Berry has shown us kind of care leads to better outcomes, and that is a 30-second example of timeliness of care. And then he goes on to talk about exactly people sitting on uncertainty, people waiting for stuff. So let's just be kind and proactive and generous. Let's make ourselves available. Why? Because the evidence shows it leads to better outcomes.
I think it also, in a way, is, I can't prove it, but it must be more efficient, because the time you spend in not knowing, the time to worry, the time pushing again to get somewhere, that is annoying time and it's horrible time. And in general practice, I think we do the same, using Accurax as a connection tool, rather than tossing people back saying, yes, you make another appointment. Sending a quick reminder is for me nothing, but it means for the patient, I'm thinking of them, I'm touching base, and it can simplify how many people are dealing with it and hide. So I want to make it more fluent, quicker connections. That's what.
Yeah. Definitely cancer tests, but a lot of other tests as well. I would always send a text saying, brilliant news, it's
exactly
normal, but come back if you've still got symptoms, whatever.
I just wanted to jump in here and follow on from this this conversation and these examples you're using, which I think are really, really helpful for our listeners to have a greater understanding of your perspectives. But I mean, Bob, you're working at this strategic level, and you're in these various different groups as well, and you're all having to deal with this practically, how we can implement kindness, now we can quantify it. And I think one of the things that I've really taken from today, Bob, is how you've really shown how it is quantifiable and how we can show how this can improve the system. But sort of, for you, well, for the three of you, over the next kind of 10 years or over a period of time, what are some of the changes that you're really trying to implement? What can we practically do to render some of what you've been discussing in the system effectively? How can we change the system in a practical sense?
So I'd look at it in a way through 4 frames. So I'm going to also answer the question a bit, Jay. So I'm like a bit like we're talking this sort of you and the trust is like, we are the system. Point 1, this system that is us, no two ways about it around stuff. But I think there's a few angles. So I don't know whether we start. I'm going to finish with the most important bit, but let's start with the least important but not unimportant. So there's a piece about policy, and we've got an opportunity at the moment with the 10-year plan and the focus. So what is clearly happening at the minute, they've already had 8,000 submissions into the 10-year plan. There is going to be no shortage of brilliant, thoughtful ideas of what let's do this. But I know already there's a deep vacuum in the how and the how we beg. And we have this big, strong bias to exactly in the way that Rue and Jens have been talking about era 2. And it's the language that I'd be using is this imbalance around the rational and the relational side of things.
Yes.
So after mid-staffs and things, we piled in on this rational bit about we need accountability, we need data, we need transparency around things, and we absolutely riddled everything with systems and processes. Now, that's really important, but it's the imbalance to the relational that is absolutely key. So let's be really clear, unless we properly address this, and I'll be really specific, the Secretary of State for Health and Care needs to come out with absolute clarity that he is currently a he, but he or she who's in that role will not tolerate going forward ongoing culture of harassment and bullying around performance management in healthcare. It has a cataclysmically problematic side effect that goes down. And if you sit at the top, you've got to get your head around that really fast. And some of the early noise around league tables on performance and some of the noise around it is totally the wrong noise. And it's a terrible, terrible mistake. So I've been now around long enough and seen enough of that. So that absolutely has to change. So anyone who's got influence and has got a meeting with Wes Streeting soon and things, we have to land that point. Why? Because not because I think it's a fashionable thing or cool or whatever. Categorically, he deeply cares about the health and well-being of this country. I'm really convinced by that. I've read enough, I've seen enough, learned enough. But currently, it's pulling completely the opposite lever to what he needs to be pulling. That has to change. Those of us who've got leadership roles in organizations, you might be in charge of a primary care network or an emerging integrated neighborhood team, or in my case, part of an executive team of a big organization. There is a fundamental piece about how we lead in a very different way that puts this critical piece about how we behave, our relational side, front and center. It's the starting point to the argument I made earlier. Without a doubt, we have to really get clear. And that means being really clear that organizations need to get rid of and stamp out where there is poor bullying behavior that's getting in the way. Now, if the pressure on them from above, to my point earlier, is so difficult, you can see how this stuff trickles down. But part of leadership is to have broad shoulders and to stop that off. Probably everyone on the call listening is a leader within a team. And really simply, if you're interested in a high performing team, you need to go after one thing above anything else, and that is creating psychological safety. So go and look at Project Aristotle that Google led, very commercial reasons, looked at what makes a high performing team. The number one thing was psychological safety. Amy Edmondson's work, leading academic from Harvard Business School on the workplace. And what that means is, do people feel everyone in the team safe to contribute their ideas, to point out if there's been a possible mistake? Doesn't matter how junior they are, they could be on day one. Do they feel safe around that stuff? And interesting, if Amy was on the podcast, she would be telling us all that a focus on the acts of kindness are your single best tool to create psychological safety. And finally, and most importantly, go back to where we started on the definition. Absolutely all of us have a choice about how we choose to behave. What sort of me is going to turn up tomorrow morning? How do we look after ourselves in a way? How do we make sure that we're got the right support? And I think to Jens's point earlier is the sort of the pressures on people make that harder and harder. But absolutely the ask of every single one of us who work in health and care anywhere in the globe is to bring our very best person, because the influence we have on the people around us through how we behave is really, really key. And that's really hard when people are burnt out and people are stressed and stretched and tired. But very fundamentally, to the conversation we were having, Ru and Jens and I, about building each other up and bigging each other up, that doesn't cost anything. And hey, there's this beautiful thing that you start doing it, you start being generous about other people, is it feels pretty good yourself. So one of the things as well to tune into is the benefit on outcome to the people receiving it, of me bigging up Jens and telling my patient what an amazing colleague and GP is. But you know what? That feels quite nice, quite happy, quite energetic myself. And maybe in a different conversation, Jens is busy telling somebody, you know what, that team at St Mary's, they're so compassionate, they're so thoughtful, they're so kind around. So let's start bigging each other up. Absolutely point out if we've got things wrong, if we've made a mistake. This isn't fluffy stuff. This is hard edge, being clear, being open, being transparent. But that would be my framing, to be honest, to think about it. Whatever you are, whatever level anyone's working at, we've got to think about it at those levels.
Thank you, Bob. I think that's really helpful, actually, to have that framework. And I think that puts this into a nice context for moving things forward as well. What's can often be quite woolly and abstract, you've put that into quite clear definition there.
There's not much to say apart from I am so adamant and passionate to bridge between, or to link relations with consultants, but also with carers. It should be straight from caring to consultant, along the whole web of caring, to flunk this with how organizations interact with each other. At the moment, I see a problem. There are some, for me personal, there are some nice relationships, as I said, from carer, from way to the intimate caring to high tech, high organization leadership roles. And that must become fluid without the inbuilt protocolized aggression. And as you said, Bob, language of sewage. It makes me smile and laugh.
Yes, if only it wasn't so serious. But yeah,
yes.
Thanks, Jens. Appreciate that too. And how about you, Ru? Is there anything you wanted to say on this topic?
You know, a lot of it's already been said by Bob and Jens. You know, I'd love it if in our meetings that we have, so we have regular clinical meetings and we discuss significant events, etc. Of course we do. And it's mostly all about outcome. It's kind of like, did you do the right investigations? Did you make the referral at the right time? Was anything missed? And that's definitely how we approach it. And I think that's the normal way to approach it. We never really talk about, were we kind? You know, those moral moments that happen throughout our practice that we've talked about in other podcasts. You know, how did we behave? Did someone feel safe? You know, even if something didn't go wrong, what we don't ask ourselves those questions. And I think we should. I hope that we can move towards different kinds of conversations, you know, when we get together.
Ru, just picking up the baton on that, one of the things we did organizationally, we learned. So as we were trying to, and one's got to test and explore this stuff. And that's why I've loved it. It's been such a great journey. And, you know, there's lots of reasons to come and hang out with you guys for an hour and things, but that big bit is learning and thinking. And what you've just said is super important. So there's definitely something you can do in a reflective way in the way you've described. But one of the things I've been testing more is, and to my point I made to James, make this the starting point. So I've been fronting up meetings and conversations in and around it. So to say, right, guys, we've got an hour and a half together. We've got 15 patients to discuss. Just before we dive into the clinical bit, let's just talk about the relational side, exactly as you've done. And what I've noticed is you can absolutely influence a conversation and the shape and the tone of it by fronting that stuff up. So I'm absolutely, like you guys, will be a sort of a curious practitioner and learner around reflective practice. It's super helpful, important. But I'm also really interested in how do we start changing the shape of conversations by, and maybe that's the activist and extrovert in me that, you know, quite likes to go in early and do that stuff. And I think in my sort of testing around this stuff, I think that's absolutely be. So I'm getting more feisty and more bullshy about fronting this stuff up. People know when I'm in a room that I'm highly likely to bring this piece up. So people will behave better. No two ways about it around, because they know as well, if things are poor, I'll call them out. And I'll try and do it in a way that is supportive and not undermining, but I'll also be really clear.
How do you do that? How do you do it? Imagine you are in a group of boys sitting around a table, and it's all privileged, and there's a certain bullying style, or you feel intimidated, or something is not right. How do you actually say that?
So timing is really important. I think increasingly we have to try and take things in the moment. I find two words really helpful: kind and helpful. So I will sometimes point out to people that things they've said are neither kind nor helpful around stuff. I'm not up for massive confrontational sort of piece on it, but at the same time, I'm not scared to play that a bit. And I think the other bit is to really be generous about intent. So my deep belief is there are very, very few evil people around. I mean, we see a few on our newsreels, but actually in healthcare, they're not. And then what's super interesting, Jens, and you guys will know this so well, is almost always people's poor behavior has an origin with their own self-esteem, issues happening in their world, their life, they've made a mistake at work, things are hard at home, whatever. And so my double-edged bit is a really clear-cut, unambiguous, that is not acceptable. And then it's a second, look, what's going on? How can we help? How can we, let's have it. And I think that stuff becomes really important. And that takes time, and you've got to spend time with people. But I'll sit in this office and have an hour and a half conversation with people if I need to around it. And you know what? If it takes one person by one person, that's what we've got to do if we're going to try and change it.
Mm.
We've certainly covered a lot of ground today, and I think what has certainly become clear to me, and I think probably to our listeners as well, is that emotional literacy and kindness are vital to the future of the National Health Service and to the future of the soul of general practice, we might say, to link it in with the book. It's been wonderful to have the three of you on the podcast today. And I have to say, I found it to be a really productive, but also a very positive sort of topic to discuss. And we've begun the topic with something that to me was quite sort of abstract, a little woolly. And I was really interested to find out more about how this concept of kindness would work and in the context of the National Health Service and beyond, and how we can implement it. And I think you guys have really covered some wonderful ground there. But I leave this feeling buoyant and positive rather than too down in the dumps, which I have to say, when we're talking about the soul of general practice, some of these podcasts, have been really, really powerful and moving, but they do leave you asking more questions than you've answered. And not that we haven't asked a lot more questions of ourselves here today, but I am leaving this feeling a lot more positive about how we can build some bridges and how we can move forward in a really productive way. So thank you all for your answers, for the information you've shared with us today, and of course for your hard work on the front lines as well. Jens, Ru, any final thoughts? And if not,
yes.
Please, Jens, go for it.
Today is disco, proper Motown disco, positive, fast-paced. A lot of the others ones were, Nile Rodgers, chic, we are family, and so. And lots of others were quite sad and minor keys, and so I'm happy. Good music today.
I've never been called. I've been called lots of things before, Jens, but never Motown. That's an absolute. Yeah, I mean, seriously.
Usually we have Nick Cave.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Ultimate respect to Nick Cave, but let's have more Nile Rodgers and less Nick Cave on the podcast in future. If we can.
Okay.
The twang of a Nile Rodgers disco riff is definitely one of the ways that we can implement more kindness in the world, that's for sure. Well, look, without further ado, I just want to thank all of you again for your time today. And everyone who's been interested in this one, do go to our Intellect's YouTube page or check us out on Spotify, where you can, of course, find all the other episodes from the Fighting for the Soul of General Practice interview series, which is part, of course, of the In Conversation podcast series produced by Intellect. So I've been James Campbell. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks all for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Thank you.